For 2 years, she thought she was just listening to her favorite true crime podcast. In reality, the dead host was narrating her life in real time. Chen had discovered Dark Confessions during a sleepless night 2 years ago, scrolling through podcast apps while dealing with insomnia that had plagued her since her divorce. The show's host, Detective Marcus Walsh, had a deep, hypnotic voice that seemed perfect for late-night listening. His cases were meticulously researched, focusing on unsolved mysteries and cold cases that kept Maya captivated for hours. What started as casual listening quickly became an obsession that filled every spare moment of her day. Maya listened to Dark Confessions religiously during her morning commute to her job as a graphic designer, while working on freelance projects at home, and especially during her evening walks through the quiet suburban neighborhood where she lived alone. Detective Walsh's storytelling was so immersive that Maya felt as if she were personally involved in solving each case. His attention to psychological detail and his ability to get inside the minds of both victims and perpetrators made every episode feel intimate and compelling. What made Dark Confessions particularly addictive for Maya was Detective Walsh's unique approach to storytelling. Unlike other true crime hosts who focus solely on famous cases, Walsh seemed to have access to incredibly detailed information about ordinary people who had experienced extraordinary circumstances. He would describe victims' daily routines, their personal habits, their fears and hopes, with such precision that Maya sometimes felt as if she were eavesdropping on real people's private lives rather than listening to solved cases. Over the months, Maya began noticing an unusual pattern in Detective Walsh's case selections. Many of the victims he profiled seemed to share characteristics with Maya herself: single women in their 30s, recently divorced, working in creative fields, living alone in quiet neighborhoods. Maya initially attributed these similarities to coincidence, assuming that Walsh simply gravitated toward cases involving women who represented a common demographic in crime statistics. But as Maya continued listening, the similarities became more specific and troubling. Detective Walsh would describe victims' morning routines that matched Maya's exactly: the same coffee shop visits, the same walking routes, even the same small rituals like checking the mailbox at precisely 6:30 p.m. every evening. Maya began to feel an uncomfortable sense of recognition when Walsh described victims' living spaces, noting details about furniture arrangement, pet ownership, and household habits that seemed to mirror her own life with unsettling accuracy. How does he know such specific details about these people's lives? Maya's growing unease reached a turning point during an episode titled "The Woman Who Lived in Fear." Detective Walsh described a victim who had recently moved to a new apartment after a difficult divorce, choosing a ground-floor unit with multiple locks because she felt safer being able to escape quickly if necessary. The victim had painted her bedroom walls sage green and had hung wind chimes outside her kitchen window because the sound helped her sleep better. Maya's blood ran cold as she realized that Walsh was describing her exact living situation, down to the specific shade of paint and the placement of her wind chimes. The episode continued with Walsh detailing the victim's work routine, her tendency to order takeout from the same Thai restaurant every Tuesday, and her habit of leaving her apartment lights on when she went out to create the illusion that someone was home. Every detail matched Maya's life perfectly, but Walsh was presenting the information as if it were part of a criminal case study rather than a description of Maya's current existence. Maya paused the episode, her hands shaking as she tried to understand how a podcast host could have such intimate knowledge of her personal life. Maya began investigating Detective Walsh and Dark Confessions more thoroughly, searching for information about the show's production, Walsh's background, and the sources of his remarkably detailed case information. To her surprise, Maya discovered very little online presence for either Walsh or his podcast. Dark Confessions appeared on major podcast platforms without any accompanying website, social media accounts, or promotional materials that might explain Walsh's research methods or provide contact information. Maya's investigation revealed that Detective Walsh had been a real person, a retired police detective who had worked cold cases for over 20 years before launching his podcast. However, Maya discovered something that made her investigation take a disturbing turn. According to public records and obituaries she found online, Detective Marcus Walsh had died in a car accident 3 years ago, several months before Dark Confessions had first appeared on podcast platforms. The realization that she had been listening to a dead man's voice for 2 years was shocking enough, but Maya faced an even more troubling question. If Detective Walsh had died before launching Dark Confessions, who was creating the episodes that continued to appear weekly? And how was this mysterious producer obtaining such detailed information about Maya's private life that even Maya herself sometimes forgot she had shared those details with anyone? Maya's obsession with Dark Confessions transformed from entertainment into terror as she realized that her favorite podcast was not just coincidentally similar to her life. It was actively documenting her existence with a level of detail that suggested constant surveillance. Maya understood that she needed to discover who was behind the podcast and how they were obtaining information about her daily activities, but she also feared what she might learn about their motivations and intentions. And what Maya would discover in the next episode would prove that her worst fears were only the beginning. Maya's investigation into Detective Walsh's death led her to contact the police department where he had worked, hoping to find colleagues who might explain how his voice was still appearing in new podcast episodes. Detective Sarah Kim, who had worked with Walsh for over a decade, agreed to meet with Maya at a coffee shop to discuss her concerns about the posthumous podcast episodes. Detective Kim confirmed that Walsh had indeed died 3 years ago and expressed shock that new episodes were still being released under his name. Marcus was working on launching a true crime podcast right before he died, Detective Kim explained. He had recorded maybe a dozen episodes about old cases, but nothing was ever published. His family donated his personal effects to charity, including all his recording equipment and case files. There's no way he could be producing new content now. Detective Kim's confirmation that Walsh was definitely dead made Maya's situation even more frightening. Someone was using a dead man's voice to narrate her life, with impossible accuracy. Detective Kim offered to help Maya investigate the source of the podcast episodes, and together they discovered that Dark Confessions was being uploaded from an IP address registered to an abandoned building in Maya's neighborhood, the same building where Detective Walsh had maintained a private recording studio before his death. The building had been empty for 3 years, with no electricity or internet service, yet somehow new podcast episodes were being uploaded from that location every week. Maya decided to visit the abandoned building, accompanied by Detective Kim for safety. The building was a converted warehouse in an industrial area that Maya passed during her daily walks but had never paid attention to. As they approached the building, Maya heard a sound that made her heart stop, the unmistakable voice of Detective Walsh coming from inside the supposedly empty structure, speaking about events that had happened to Maya just the day before. Inside the building, Maya and Detective Kim discovered Walsh's recording studio exactly as he had left it 3 years ago, complete with professional audio equipment, case files, and personal items that suggested he had been working there recently. The studio showed no signs of abandonment or decay. It appeared to be maintained and actively used, despite the building having no power or caretakers. Most disturbing was the evidence that someone had been using the studio to record new episodes, with scripts and notes scattered around the desk that detailed Maya's recent activities with frightening precision. The scripts Maya found contained information about her life that no living person should have known, private conversations she had held in her apartment, thoughts she had written in her personal journal, and even dreams she had experienced but never shared with anyone. The level of detail suggested that Maya was under constant surveillance, but Detective Kim found no evidence of cameras, recording devices, or any technology that could explain how someone was gathering such intimate information about Maya's private life. As Maya and Detective Kim examined the studio more carefully, they began hearing Walsh's voice again, this time speaking directly to them rather than recording a podcast episode. The voice seemed to come from the recording equipment itself, though the machines showed no signs of being powered on or operational. Walsh's voice addressed Maya by name, apologizing for frightening her but explaining that he needed her help to solve the most important case of his career, his own murder. "How can a dead man be talking to us right now?" Detective Walsh's voice explained that his death had not been an accident, but rather a murder committed by someone who wanted to prevent him from exposing a criminal conspiracy he had discovered during his investigation of cold cases. Walsh had been close to revealing the truth about a network of criminals who had been avoiding prosecution for decades by eliminating witnesses and manipulating evidence. His podcast had been intended to expose these crimes and bring justice to victims whose cases had been deliberately buried. Walsh revealed that his spirit had become trapped in his recording studio, unable to move on until he could complete his final investigation and expose the truth about his murder. He had been using his supernatural connection to the studio's equipment to continue producing podcast episodes, but he needed Maya's help because she was the only person who had been listening carefully enough to notice the inconsistencies in his stories and investigate his death. Maya learned that the detailed information Walsh had been sharing about her life was not the result of surveillance, but rather his attempt to get her attention and draw her to his studio. Walsh had been studying Maya's routines and habits through supernatural means, incorporating details about her life into his podcast episodes as a way of communicating with her and encouraging her to investigate the source of his continued broadcasts. Detective Kim remained skeptical about the supernatural explanation for Walsh's voice, but she couldn't deny the physical evidence they had discovered or explain how someone could be producing such detailed information about Maya's private life. Kim agreed to help Maya and Walsh investigate the circumstances of Walsh's death and the criminal network he had been trying to expose, understanding that solving this case might be the only way to help Maya escape from whatever was happening to her. Walsh provided Maya and Detective Kim with information about the criminal conspiracy he had discovered, revealing that several prominent figures in their city had been involved in covering up murders, manipulating evidence, and eliminating witnesses for over 20 years. Walsh had been killed because he was about to publish evidence that would have exposed the entire network and sent dozens of powerful people to prison for their crimes. But what Walsh revealed about Maya's own connection to the criminal conspiracy would change everything she thought she knew about her life. Detective Walsh's voice revealed the most shocking truth of all. Maya was not a random podcast listener who had stumbled upon his supernatural broadcasts, but rather the daughter of one of the murder victims whose case had led Walsh to discover the criminal conspiracy. Maya's father had been a journalist who had been investigating the same network of corruption when he was killed in what was made to look like a car accident, the same method used to murder Walsh years later. "Your father, David Chen, was my partner in investigating this conspiracy," Walsh's voice explained through the recording equipment. "He had evidence that could have exposed everything, but they killed him before he could publish his story. I've been trying to reach you for 3 years because you're the only family member left who might have access to the evidence he hid before his death." Maya's world crumbled as she realized that her father's death, which she had been told was an accident when she was a teenager, had actually been murder. Walsh explained that Maya's father had hidden crucial evidence about the conspiracy in a location that only family members would think to look, and that Maya's recent divorce and move to a new apartment had brought her back to the neighborhood where her father had lived and worked. Walsh had been using his podcast to guide Maya back to areas associated with her father's investigation, hoping that being in familiar locations would trigger memories or intuition that might lead her to the hidden evidence. Detective Kim helped Maya search her father's old belongings, which Maya had stored in a garage after her mother's death several years earlier. Among her father's possessions, Maya found a collection of encrypted files and documents that provided detailed evidence of murders, cover-ups, and corruption involving judges, police officials, and business leaders who had been operating with impunity for decades. The evidence was comprehensive enough to prosecute dozens of people and solve multiple cold cases that had been deliberately mishandled. Maya realized that her father's journalism career and his investigation into the conspiracy had made their entire family targets, and that her mother's sudden illness and death several years earlier might not have been natural causes. Walsh confirmed Maya's suspicions, revealing that the criminal network had been systematically eliminating anyone connected to her father's investigation, but that they had waited to target Maya until she became a potential threat by returning to her father's neighborhood. The evidence Maya found included recordings of conversations, financial documents, and photographs that implicated powerful figures in their city's government and business community. Maya understood that possessing this evidence put her in immediate danger, but she also recognized that it was her father's legacy and her responsibility to ensure that justice was finally served for all the victims who had been silenced over the years. With Detective Kim's help, Maya contacted federal law enforcement agencies and journalists who could safely handle the evidence and ensure that it received proper attention despite the local corruption that had protected the conspiracy for so long. Maya learned that several other victims' families had been trying to investigate similar crimes, and that her father's evidence was the missing piece that could finally bring the entire network to justice. Detective Walsh's voice expressed gratitude and relief as Maya prepared to expose the truth that he and her father had died trying to reveal. Walsh explained that his spirit could finally find peace once the evidence was published and the criminals were held accountable for their crimes. Maya realized that her 2 years of podcast addiction had not been random entertainment, but rather her father and Walsh working together from beyond death to guide her toward justice. The publication of Maya's father's evidence led to one of the largest corruption investigations in the city's history, resulting in dozens of arrests and the reopening of hundreds of cold cases that had been deliberately mishandled. Maya's courage in following Walsh's supernatural guidance and exposing the truth brought justice to countless victims and their families who had been waiting decades for answers. Maya learned that sometimes the voices we hear in the darkness are not meant to frighten us, but to guide us toward truth and justice. Her experience taught her that love and dedication can transcend death, and that family bonds can survive even the most powerful attempts to silence them. In Walsh's final recorded message, preserved on an old cassette tape in his studio, he left Maya a personal note. "Your father would be proud of the woman you've become. The courage to seek truth runs in your family." She had listened to a dead man's voice for 2 years. But in the end, that voice had led her home to the truth her father died protecting. If you discovered that your favorite podcast host was dead but still producing episodes about your personal life, would you investigate this supernatural mystery, or would you try to escape whatever was pursuing you? If Maya's journey to uncover her father's legacy and Detective Walsh's supernatural guidance moved you, like, subscribe, and share this story. Have you ever felt like someone was watching your life unfold, or experienced coincidences that seemed too specific to be random? Tell us in the comments.